I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. Later, we'll talk about migrants and their impact on the city. But first, Their America is Vanishing. That's the title of a recent article about Republican districts and Trump supporters across the country, many of whom continue to deny the 2020 election results. Towns that once were predominantly white in places like Texas have undergone significant demographic change. Politicians seem to be relying on a white fear narrative to drive voters to the polls in places where change seems to be inevitable. Two New York Times investigative reporters, David Kirkpatrick and Mike Keller, took a long look into these patterns, and David Kirkpatrick joins us now. David, you were looking at what we called objector districts. What is an objector district?
Well, after the 2020 election, we were struck that 139 House Republicans had all voted together to reject the results of the Electoral College. So we set out to find out what was going on there. You know, that's an extraordinary step by a majority of the party, which is likely next week to be the ruling party in the House. And part of that was, you know, what were they thinking? What were the lawmakers thinking? What were the debates like in the halls of Congress? But hovering over that was their constituents. You know, what were the demands that were pushing them in this direction? So we called these 139 the objectors who objected to the Electoral College. And we set out to make a deep study of their districts to find out what was going on. How were those districts different than other Republicans, and what made them push their lawmakers in that direction?
And were they following their constituents or leading them, did we find out?
Well, that's always a question, as you know, in any political decision. Certainly in this case, pretty much all the lawmakers said they were feeling vigorous pressure from their grassroots. You know, one after another. In private internal meetings that we got recordings of and in interviews with us, they all said, you know, my folks had their pants on fire demanding that I object.
And why did they object? What distinguished these districts compared to either other Republican districts or other districts in general?
Well, we should be clear that the people who objected and the constituents who demanded that the representatives objected will pretty much all say it was the evidence. You know, they'll say it's just not possible that Biden beat Trump, and here's the reasons, blah, 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 blah. We know that's not true. Trump won the election. So in that context, we tried to figure out what else was going on. And my colleague, Michael Keller, who's a much more skilled computer programmer than I am, analyzed, 200 different variables across all the congressional districts. And what emerged was two things. One is that these were districts where the white share of the population was falling faster than in other Republican districts. I mean, as you know, the United States is moving pretty quickly towards the point, probably about 20 years from now, when it will be a minority-majority country. Mm-hmm. These are districts where that's happening visibly, happening fastest. And the other thing is that in these districts, the constituents had less income and less education than in other Republican districts.
One thing that strikes me as fascinating is that the definition of white, most Hispanic people define themselves as white. So when we look at that point somewhere in 2040, 2050, that the country supposedly is going to turn majority-minority, didn't Americans once consider Irish, Italians, Jews, non-white also? Are we, by 2050, going to consider Hispanics to be white too? Is the definition of minority going to change by then?
You know, even describing it gets complicated. When you start talking about a minority-majority, you begin to wonder, well, what do those terms mean anymore? When I say white, I mean white non-Hispanic, and I'm just trying to spare your viewers that little bit of complexity. But that's what we're really talking about here. People who self-identify as white and don't identify as Hispanic, understanding that many people identify as both.
What are people so afraid of?
That's a good question. I think that many white people think of themselves as the majority of this country. What political scientists say is that these two factors we saw, the kind of educational and economic differences on the one hand and the declining white population on the other, kind of fuse together, because white people who have less education and less income are understandably going to feel more worried about their status. Their position in society is more vulnerable, and they feel more threatened. And what the political scientists have found, independent of us, is that this fear of a kind of displacement of your superior status as the ethnic majority makes people worried. You know, the people who are most likely to support the Stop the Steal movement are ones who have a sense of quote unquote white solidarity, some political scientists have found, meaning they feel that white people are in some sense under threat and need to act together to try to stop that.
One thing that you and Mike Keller wrote at the Times that I found more fascinating than the rest of the fascinating story was the GOP's hold on those districts reflects its shift away from its former country club image to become the party of those left behind. Wasn't that the Democratic Party? Didn't that used to be the party of those left behind?
Yeah, well, people like us who maybe are a certain age or have read American history might be surprised, but what emerges from the statistics is you see the districts of the objectors, and then a step up in income and education, the other Republicans, and yet a further step up, the Democratic districts. So the fact of the matter is, Democratic districts are better educated and better off. And the Times in the past has reported on this, the trend over the last 20 years or so, as the Republican Party has increasingly become the party of those who are economically disadvantaged or left behind, despite the fact that people who remember Franklin Delano Roosevelt probably think of the Democrats that way.
So can the Democrats do anything about that, or is it sort of too late? Has that shift become kind of permanent?
Well, I'm a journalist and not a political consultant, so that's
Correct.
over my head.
Okay, I guess that's true. It's not in your pay grade. Let me ask you, as a journalist, as a Times journalist, as a New York Times journalist, how is it covering an issue like this? Do people talk to you, or do they shy away from you? Or do they say, hey, you know, you're part of the mainstream New York press, why bother talking to you? You're not going to report things honestly anyway.
You know, we get a little bit of both. Certainly we now live in a hyper-partisan world where many people assume every news organization has a predisposition, and we have to work through that. You know, but as you know, when you show up and you're open and you listen fairly, often people will talk. In this case, you know, I personally have been surprised to see how few Republican lawmakers these days want to speak to the New York Times, and we did speak to Representative Troy Nehls, who represents Fort Bend, Texas, at some length, and that was a great help.
Mm-hmm. And why can Republican lawmakers, and sometimes Democrats too, of course, get away without talking to the press? How can they not respond? You know, you and I are old enough to know that we're used to dogging public officials and harassing them even to get them to respond to a question. How can they avoid the press?
Well, it's a question of which press. Mm-hmm. You know, I think the people who are inclined to avoid the New York Times may have other people they quite like to talk to. Mm-hmm. It's true that we have all dogged public officials. We've also been dogged by their press secretaries. Mm-hmm. So it's been a two-way street, and now we live in a fractured media world where if you want to speak only to your base, you can do it through other channels.
That's true. There are alternatives, many of them now. One of the frightening things that you wrote about, you and Mike Keller in the Times, are that many of these people are willing to reject democratic norms because they see it as a way to protect their own status. How far are they willing to go?
Well, that's a very good question. And again, that there is not so much our finding. We observed a correlation, and we're relying on the work of other researchers, sociologists and political scientists, to come up with that solution. In answer to your question, how far are they going to go? I guess we'll wait and see.
What if Donald Trump becomes a martyr, if he's indicted, if he's convicted? You know, does this make him more of a hero to these objectors, or do they write him off? And again, this is predictive, but listening to the way they talk, listening to the way they link their objections, their worry about status to Trump himself, Trump the man, how does that work? How does that correlate?
Well, one of the things that we discovered in our reporting that surprised us is that many of the Republican lawmakers, after the riot of January 6th, thought, uh-oh, we're in trouble. we're about to face a backlash. We've got to distance ourselves from this position. In fact, that isn't how it went. The Republican Party base became more and more convinced that the election was stolen, and having objected was not a liability but a political asset. Looking forward, will that continue? I think, based on my experience of American politics, a lot depends on the next presidential nomination. If someone else, if another name emerges to be the standard bearer for the Republican Party, President Trump may not like it, but he will relinquish his place in the minds of the Republican base.
One of the things that you wrote about, too, was the effect of race on all of this. And you quote someone as saying, well, you know, I'm colorblind, but a lot of those people out there, a lot of white people don't like certain people coming here, presumably referring to immigrants and other people of foreign birth. How much of a factor is race in this rather than economics?
Well, the thing that was the most striking to us is that, you know, the white, non-Hispanic percentage of the population in these districts is declining 35% faster than in other Republican districts. That's significant and it's inescapable. And if you then connect it to the fairly intuitive conclusion of these political scientists that white voters, even if they're in all white districts, if they lack an education or income, are going to feel more vulnerable for the same reasons, it does feel like race is a salient factor in this. And indeed, you might expect that. I mean, the United States is about to become, I think, the world's first democracy to reach a sort of minority-majority status in 20 years. It makes sense that that would be a big moment in American history.
And of course, as you point out, hovering over all of this is the fact that the population is still far ahead of the voter registration, and whites still constitute a majority in the population, and even more so of the voters, and that's likely to change as well. David Kirkpatrick, New York Times reporter, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up next, the ongoing influx of migrants in New York City. Welcome back. A newly opened shelter on Randall's Island with 500 beds for single men is one of the ways New Yorkers responding to the migrant population. But what our next guest found, as she reported at the Port Authority bus station, were the acts of generosity being bestowed upon the city's newest arrivals by ordinary New Yorkers. New York Times Metro reporter Karen Zrake has been covering the story on the ground. She joins us now. Karen, what are New Yorkers doing to help?
Thanks for having me, Sam. There's really been an outpouring of generous acts of support, logistical help, donations from around the city. There are sites like schools, houses of worship, community organizations that are doing a lot to try and just make sure people have the basics, especially as it gets cold.
And what can New Yorkers do? How can they volunteer? How can they help?
There are lots of ways. The city has set up an online portal where you can go and look for places to donate goods. It seems like, from what I'm hearing, although people do need heavier clothes like jackets and coats, what would be probably most helpful is newer items. Toiletries, monetary donations, personal effects, that kind of thing. People really came with nothing, so they need a lot of the basics.
And how many people have actually come here from where, and how many have come on their own as opposed to being shipped here by other cities?
The city says that about 20,000 people have come through the shelter system on buses, basically from Texas. Most were Venezuelan. And that seems really to have tapered off now. Mm-hmm. There are not a lot of new arrivals showing up, for example, at the Port Authority, but there are still 16,000 people in the city's care. And so in the shelter system or in hotels.
And one of the things you pointed out in the Times is that a lot of them need and would like jobs. They're not here to live off the dole.
Right. There's a long delay for people who are putting in asylum applications to be able to submit applications for work permits. And then they have to wait for them to get approved as well. So that puts people in a gray area where they need to take any odd job that they can, to have any money, not only for themselves, but to send back to, for example, Venezuela, where it's going to go a lot farther than it will here.
And so they take jobs off the books, perhaps, and other things just to get by.
Some people.
How effective or chaotic is the city in providing services and shelter?
The city has really touted its performance. Mayor Eric Adams has repeated that no migrant child, slept outside on the city's watch. The city did put up families at hotels around the boroughs, as well as in Manhattan. The city also set up a big tent system.
How is that working?
Or
I'm
I
not
should
sure I'd
say-
like to live in a tent, especially as it gets colder.
Because there were delays, right, the city wanted to open this tent site at Orchard Beach. There was a big outcry against that. There were concerns about flooding. There were concerns from the neighbors that it was just, remote. So the city ended up,
Concerns about the neighbors that it was remote or that it was too close to the neighbors.
yeah, both, I think, yeah.
Right.
And also concerns from a lot of, members of the city council and, advocates saying, why don't we just house people in existing buildings? So the city ended up moving the tent site to Randall's Island. But it opened exactly a week after the federal government announced that it was changing its policy at the border with regard to Venezuelan asylum seekers and essentially closing the border to them. So that really has diminished the flow of people coming to the city.
Are we getting any help from the federal government financially or otherwise, or are we picking up the burden of this ourselves as a city?
The city is asking for federal support. They've put in an application with FEMA. But, it remains to be seen how much help we're going to get to deal with this influx.
Karen, as you've written, New York is unique for having this right to shelter law. What does that law actually say, and what are other cities around the country doing?
The city is mandated by law. It has to provide a bed, to people in need. And so it is doing that. It is complying with that. Again, it's for the migrants, it's housing families in hotels and other sites. It's only putting single men on Randall's Island. It should
In the
also-
tents.
In the tents. It should also be said that there appear to be few people actually at Randall's Island, because as I mentioned, the flow of buses has slowed considerably, and the city won't release the amount of people that it has admitted to Randall's Island, but reporters who have gone and stood outside have seen very little activity. So it doesn't seem like there are that many people there. But the city is still providing a lot more help than many other places are, because of its commitment, New York is a city of immigrants, officials have repeated that over and over again, and because of its legal obligations.
Karen, whatever we call these people, migrants, refugees, you talk to them. Are they happy they came here? Do they have regrets? Are they sorry they left their native country? Did they think they are or will be better off being here?
I think it's still very early to answer many of those questions. For people who have come in the last few months, it remains to be seen how it's going to work out. Whether people are going to be able to make a living, whether they're going to be able to stay long term, those are all open questions.
Why did they come?
The people that I spoke with talked about the basic, we are talking about people from a bunch of countries, but in terms of Venezuela, this country has been in collapse for years, basically. It's a repressive government, the economy is a disaster, prices are extremely high. People said over and over again, because of hyperinflation, the salary of a teacher can't buy food for a week. So you have political repression, a terrible economy, also crime, really unchecked crime that is driving people to leave. Also, a lot of Venezuelans had been living in other South American countries, like Colombia, Peru, et cetera, and had tried to make a living there, but especially as the economy in those countries got even worse during the pandemic, people really said, I don't see a way forward.
Karen, how does this problem, the migrant problem or the migrant challenge, however we want to describe it, mesh with the situation of homelessness in the city in general. Homelessness, which, as you reported, has reached record levels and which has defied every mayoral administration so far to cope with.
Yeah, I mean, there's something like 60,000 people in the shelter system now. Mayor Adams declared a state of emergency.
Which allows him to do what? What does that change?
My understanding is that the state of emergency allows the mayor to set up shelters around the city without going through the usual review process. So you don't have as long a period where, you know, the neighborhood can raise concerns, et cetera, et cetera. You can do things quickly, you can be more agile. And so, you know, the city has been coping for a long time, you know, with an overcrowded, overburdened shelter system. Then when you suddenly had, you know, thousands of people arriving, needing help, and, you know, many of them not speaking English, you know, being in really dire straits, it put an incredible burden on the system.
And do we just have to deal now with a permanent homeless population? I mean, if we can even call them homeless, they are in the shelter system, so they are not homeless in effect out on the street. They like permanent homes. But are we going to have that indefinitely?
I think that's more of a question for the housing team. You know,
I think so,
but
or for sociologists, perhaps.
Yeah, I
Or-
mean, my understanding, though, is that we have a shortage of housing in this city, and that we're going to have to address it.
And also, we have a strange definition of what is affordable housing as well. We think of affordable housing in terms of people making up to $100,000 or more a year, and obviously that's not affordable to an awful lot of people. Let me just switch subjects very quickly, if I may. Crime in the subway. You point out in another story in the Times that there are going to be more cops on the subway. Is that going to help reduce crime? Is that going to help people's perception of crime in the subway?
Well, that's another question that's hard.
I don't want to give you easy questions here.
Yeah. The mayor and the governor announced on Saturday that they would surge more police into the subways and that they would put MTA police at major transit hubs like, you know, Jamaica Station, Atlantic Terminal, so that the NYPD officers there can go out elsewhere in the system. So the hope is that seeing police officers will be a deterrent to crime, that if there is crime, if they can address it quickly, and that people will, you know, just feel safer by seeing them. You know, remains to be seen whether it's going to be effective. They have surged police officers before.
Right. Well, we'll see if it helps riders feel more confident and maybe scares away some potential criminals as well. Thanks to Karen Drake of the New York Times, who covers homelessness and the new migrants. And coming up next, I'll have some thoughts on power in the city. In the 1970s, Ed Kosticki, a muscular Manhattan lawyer and Democratic leader, would regularly rank the 10 most powerful New Yorkers for New York Magazine. They were called power brokers. Bob Caro popularized the term in his epic biography of Robert Moses. Who are the power brokers? Mayor Lindsay asked rhetorically in 1966 when he defiantly challenged their hegemony. They know who they are. So did everyone else. Nelson and David Rockefeller, Walter Wriston, Victor Gottbaum, Al Shanker, Hugh Carey, Harry Van Arsdale, the Cardinal, Felix Rohatyn, Dick Ravitch. They were visible and instrumental a decade later during the city's fiscal crisis. Now, another group of New York business and civic leaders, led by Dick Ravitch, is worried about the city. They're concerned that Mayor Adams lacks vision for governing. They're drafting a policy agenda for him to follow. Any bold agenda will demand the mayor's total commitment. It will also require those business and civic leaders to broker their power and deliver their constituencies. For better or for worse, though, they are not the power brokers of times past. Power in general has become more diffuse. Globalization has reduced the personal, professional, and financial stake of bank presidents and corporate moguls in the city's future. Public officials have been shackled in the backlash to Robert Moses' maxim that if the ends don't justify the means, what does? A whole generation, Ed Kostikian told me after he retired from ranking the power brokers, has been brought up believing that leadership is out of place and in bad taste, that you have to find out what your people think first, and that you can't take a chance. If I wanted to do something today and was promised 10 people to make it happen, who would I pick? Kostikian asked. I'd be hard-pressed, because when you say, what is power? One question is there power? For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.